This part we're going to deal with the treatment of anxiety. We're going to deal with it quite briefly, and in the same way that we've been approaching other treatments, I'm going to cover the most widely used treatments and not every single drug that might possibly be used to treat anxiety, and just the ones that you're likely to see most commonly. Now, anxiety disorders are classified as mental illness, or psychiatric disorders, but there's a whole range of specific disorders that are classified as anxiety disorders, and you can see some of them here. And it is actually only some of them, because if you were a psychiatrist, you'd know lots of names of specific disorders and phobias that would all go under the umbrella of anxiety disorder. So all of these things represent anxiety disorders. There's social anxiety, for example, which is becoming very common in teenagers in particular. That's severe anxiety associated with just mixing with people and going out and being in company. There's generalized anxiety disorder, which is the one that's most recognizable to most of us, which is, as the name suggests, simply a level of anxiety about everything, not focused on any specific event or anything. There's a range of phobias about specific things that people may suffer from. There's also obsessive compulsive disorder, which is characterized by obsessive worry about certain things, which results in obsessive checking and rechecking. Somebody who's obsessive about security and can't leave their house without running back and checking that they've locked all the doors 25 times. Another quite common one is obsession about germs and lack of cleanliness, and the person washes their hands so many times during the day that their skin starts to become irritated and painful and raw. So the OCD, obsessive compulsive disorders, a range of those. There's also post-traumatic stress disorder, which is linked to a particular traumatic event, and there could be a range of events that could trigger that. And then there is panic disorder, with or without agoraphobia. Agoraphobia being a fear of being outside or fear of open spaces or generally being out in the world. And panic disorder can occur along with that. Quite commonly it does come along with agoraphobia, or it can be without it. Often the panic disorder is thought to lead to agoraphobia because the panic attacks can strike with no apparent warning and fairly unpredictably, and so if they happen in a public place, people get very scared that if they go out that they will have a panic attack, and it will be awful if it happens in a public place and people see them having the panic attack. And so people with panic disorder develop a fear of going out into public places for that reason. So all of these things that you're seeing here are classified as anxiety disorders. They tend to be on a spectrum of severity, with generalized anxiety disorder being at the mild end of the spectrum and panic disorder being at the more difficult to treat end, or perhaps severer end of the anxiety spectrum, and these various other things coming somewhere in between. But they are all characterized by excessive worry and fear about either a specific thing or general worry and fear. Now, it's not true to say now that they are all treated in the same way, because they're not. It was true at one time, but more recently the treatment for these anxiety disorders has altered so that the anti-anxiety drugs that we're going to talk about now would be mainly used to treat generalized anxiety disorders, whereas the obsessive compulsive disorder, panic disorder, and social anxiety disorder, those things have tended to be fairly resistant to treatment by the drugs that we're about to talk about, and therefore their treatment has taken a slightly different direction. So the next set of drugs that we're going to talk about would be mainly now used to treat generalized anxiety disorder, which is more common than these other specific disorders. This is a prevalence from the US. You can see here that in terms of prevalence, all of the anxiety disorders are lagging behind depression as a problem. Lifetime prevalence, that means that there is essentially for any person in the population around about a 16% chance that during their lifetime they will suffer from major depression or social anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and generalized anxiety, and so on. Now, me having just said that generalized anxiety is more common than all of the others, you can see that clearly on this study it isn't. Social anxiety is growing and becoming more and more prevalent, particularly in teenagers. So you can see that where this study was carried out, it was coming out just behind depression as a lifetime prevalence of 12%. Then followed by post-traumatic stress disorder. Now obviously you would expect the prevalence of this particular anxiety disorder to change depending on whether there have been major traumatic events that would have affected a large percentage of the population or not. For example, war, terrorist events, those sorts of things would alter the prevalence of that disorder. Then here comes the generalized anxiety disorder, around about 5.7%, slightly less common. In this case, panic disorder, 4.7%, and then obsessive compulsive disorder, relatively uncommon compared to these other disorders. And then there would also be your specific phobias, and of course those would be less common also, unless you added them all up, in which case they would probably add up to quite a few. But that's just to give you some idea of how many people are anxious versus how many people are depressed. But we now know that in terms of the treatment and the characteristics of both depression and anxiety, that there's a lot of overlap between depressive disorders and anxiety disorders. And in fact, psychiatrists and other people are starting to think that perhaps it's not really correct to think of them as two different areas of disorder, that the anxiety disorders and depression often occur together. It's very common if someone has depression for there to be a component of anxiety with that, and so perhaps it's a little bit false to think of them as two completely separate types of disorder.